Hello everyone and welcome. So the biggest question in interpretation and storytelling work is always, I think, how do we know if our interpretation actually works? I think we're all familiar with the traditional surveys and visitor questionnaires and all of that, and they can be really good in providing a sort of overview and data about your visitors. But the problem is when we conduct visitor surveys, for example, about a specific exhibition project we have done, like for example an exhibition or an activity or something, we get information about that specific project, and that is rarely something you can just transfer to your next interpretation project, because your next interpretation project might be about something completely different. It might be aimed at a completely different audience. It might be using new communication platforms. You might be partnering up with external partners you haven't really used before or tried before, and so on and so on. So it's very difficult to take the information you have gathered about a running or a current interpretation project and just transfer it to your next project. So very often what happens with visitor surveys and questionnaires and so on is that we look at that data and then we put it in a drawer and we forget about it, to be honest. And you've spent a lot of work and time collecting that data and we don't really use it, we don't really make the best of it, which is such a shame. So I thought it was time to have a look at some very, very basic ways of actually observing your visitors and figuring out whether or not your interpretation works and how it works for you. As always, if you like the content of these videos, please remember to like them, subscribe to the channel and add your comments below. So let me start by asking you a very direct question. Have you ever spied on your visitors? Because I have, and I absolutely love it. I hope not in a creepy way, but it can actually give you a lot of information about them. What I like to do is quite literally go incognito, so without my ID, without uniform, if it's a place where you're wearing a uniform and so on, pretend you're a visitor and go into your exhibition spaces or activity or wherever you're doing your interpretation work, and observe visitors, listen in on what they're talking about. The thing is about visitors when they are out and about, so to speak, is that they don't necessarily tell staff whether or not they like something. They talk to each other about that. So if there is a member of staff anywhere near, they usually don't talk about what they like or dislike. But they have no problem with other visitors hearing them talk when they are in groups, like in a family group, for example. And you can observe that and you can use that. And it's actually really valuable information you can get out of that. There are also things you can do as your project is running, as you are doing the actual work. So I thought, let's have a look at how you can observe your visitors and how you can actually get some useful information out of those observations that you can implement directly into your interpretation work. The first thing is actually about when you are conducting your project work. So when you're in the middle of setting it all up, use some test groups during the project work to test out specific elements of your interpretation project. It can be interactives in an exhibition, for example. I think that's a classic. It can also be certain activities or parts of an event. And these test groups will provide you with some very direct feedback that you can implement as the work is progressing. And this is very important because this will be as you are going on, as you're moving along. So this will be as you are actually doing the work. And this can be really, really effective. Another thing is, once your interpretation work is up and running, as I said, walk around the spaces, pretend to be a visitors, and have a look at what do visitors respond to in your interpretation and how do they respond. And this is in a very basic way. So do they talk about what's in front of them? Do they engage? Do they ask questions? Not necessarily of staff, but of each other. Are they engaged in what is in front of them? This is something we can all observe. And no, it's not actually that creepy, because very often we observe visitors talk to each other, so strangers talking to each other about something that's right in front of them. This is what happens when we become engaged in something. Do visitors ask for more information? Now, this can be from staff, but it can also be from, for example, websites. What do they look at on websites? What are they interested in? If there are written information about, like leaflets and so on, what do they gather? What sort of information are they interested in? Now, where do visitors gather and why? I talked about social spaces in a previous video, and I'm going to link to that in the description below. But are there places, physical spaces, where your visitors naturally gather? And if so, why? What's happening in these spaces? What are they doing here? This is an interesting one as well. Do visitors buy items in your shop relating to what they have experienced? So if you have a shop, a museum shop, a visitor shop, and so on, what do visitors buy after a specific experience? If you have like books, you might have toys, tools, copies of historical objects, and so on. What are they interested in right after they have experienced your interpretation work? Usually a shop will come at the end of an experience. So this can be a brilliant way of observing what does their experience reflect when they get to the shop area. Do visitors sign up for more afterwards? So for example, newsletters, if that's something you offer, do they take leaflets, brochures with them? Do they somehow take more information home? Have you sparked their curiosity? This is essentially what you're trying to observe here. The final one is, how do visitors actually look when they leave? This is something that front staff can very easily observe. Do they look happy? Do they look satisfied, fulfilled with what they have just experienced? Do they hurry up and leave in a hurry because they can't wait to get out of there? Do they smile at staff? Observe their body language, how they interact with each other. If they are on their own, how do they look? Are they deep in thought? Are they engaged in, maybe they've picked up some further information like leaflets or something? What do they do when they leave? This can give you a huge indicator as well about how they have experienced your interpretation. I think it's always really tricky to fully observe visitors, and usually your information will be a combination of lots of different sources. You will get feedback along the way as you do your project work, but also once it is up and running. And sometimes it's not really doable to change like major things in your interpretation according to the feedback you get. But sometimes there's actually a lot you can do depending on how visitors respond to it. Please let me know about your experiences here. It would be really interesting to hear about how you have gone about observing visitors, what worked for you, what didn't work, what's the best way of figuring out whether or not your interpretation works. Please share your thoughts on this.